iTunes U at Kennesaw State University.
Merhaba, hoş geldiniz, welcome, good evening. My name is Dan Paraka. I'm Director of International Services and Programs, and if you're here for the next Year of Turkey lecture, you're in the right place. We're winding down. We're getting down to the last about 3 or 4 lectures now. We've got some really great lectures to finish the year. Tonight's lecture is no exception. We're really delighted tonight to have Dale Eickelman here with us tonight. He is the Ralph and Richard Lazarus Professor of Anthropology and Human Relations from Dartmouth College. He has a Master's of Arts degree in Islamic Studies from McGill University in Canada, and a PhD in Anthropology from the University of Chicago. His publications include Public Islam and the Common Good, The Middle East and Central Asia, an Anthropological Approach, and New Media in the Muslim World, the Emerging Public Sphere. He's former president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. Earlier this year, we had the incoming president, Virginia Aksan, was here earlier this year, and so that's a nice connection, I think, during the series. He's senior advisor to Kuwait's first private liberal arts university, the American University of Kuwait, and he shared with me a nice brochure on the university. It looks like a great place. Maybe if some students are interested, we could help you study there. And he's presently editing a book called Islam in the Modern World, the Fethullah Gulen Movement. Again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Eickelman.
Almost. Thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here, especially because I think that there is no other university in the United States of America at this time that has such an extensive series of presentations on Turkey in any given year. There tend to be intensive conferences where people flock together and then they disappear, and 3 or 4 years later a book comes out. But this is something a little bit different, I think, where you've covered the gamut of what there is to cover, I think, in the Year of Turkey from many different perspectives and prisms, and a pleasure being here. I've spent a lot of time working in North Africa, and I was absolutely surprised in walking through the doors of Kennesaw State just now to see not just a kind of a montage of things having to do with Morocco, but rather about a particular part of Casablanca, Beni Masik, and a fascinating sort of exhibit. If I learn who did it, there's 1 or 2 translation problems between Arabic and English, but it's so good. It would be bad form of me to point out anything like that, but it was a very nice surprise. I'm very glad to be able to talk about Turkey today, but since there's anthropologists in the room amongst others, what I'm going to try to do at the same time is suggest why Turkey is good to think with. If you're interested in Islam and democratization, or if you're interested in themes such as globalization, and it's hard for anybody to say that those are themes that don't interest them. Turkey plays, in my judgment, a pivotal role in the cultural, political, and religious imagination of us all. And some of the things going on in Turkey now, I think, can help us to understand how really significant political and social change take place. To frame things for Turks who are in the audience, or people of Turkish origin, if you're studying history textbooks, you always learn about the top-down approach. This is where the Ottoman Empire quickly becomes the Turkish Republic, at least as it's taught in school books, and with a very, very different sort of emphasis and popular base. Now, what I'm going to be emphasizing a lot today is something that's a little messier, but it's a lot more basic, I think, to how we think about ourselves and how we think about our societies, and that's the bottom-up approach. The approach by which people learn to talk to one another, and more importantly, in the highly diverse communities in which we live, to learn to trust one another. Let me give you a vignette, and it's not going to be from Turkey. It's going to be from from Amsterdam in the Netherlands in 1999. There's a member of Parliament, the Tweede Kamer there, in 1999, who took me on a tour of various Muslim community centers, mostly Moroccan and mostly Turkish. His name, I'll mention, was Osama Sharabi. After 2001, he's changed his name slightly to Sam Sharabi. You can figure out why. He now teaches at Emory University, which is the reason I'm mentioning him by name, because he has a strong political past, and as a Moroccan who became a Dutch citizen, he was a two-term member of the Dutch Parliament that served for a total of 6 years. I can't help but add a diversionary note. In this country, after serving in our Congress and the like, you begin getting lucrative consulting contracts and everything else. What you get in Holland is a bicycle to take home. It's a little bit different. Try doing that with your elected representatives or with Newt Gingrich. I think he got more than a bicycle for what he did. However, what you could see when you went into the Moroccan centers was let's say, a hostility to talking to anybody, even a member of the Dutch Parliament who could speak Arabic. There are many languages in Morocco, but you have to come back. The only person who can talk is not here. When we go to the Turkish centers, there's no problem. The director wasn't there either because we were doing cold calling. But then the deputy director and the deputy of the deputy director took over and showed us the gamut of what they were doing. Dutch language lessons for recent immigrants, classes in how to take advantage of the various things that citizens and non-citizens could take care of in the community, how to access health services, whole range of things you could do as citizens, including how to register if you were a Dutch citizen to take part in elections. And it was then that it dawned on me that despite all of the things that I'd have Turks telling me about the travails of democracy in their own country, that there was a substantial base on which one could build in order to think about what one has to do in a democracy, and for those who chose to come to Europe to assimilate into European society at the same time. We'll come back to the top-down approach later, but as I say, the rougher one and the story that's not often told is the bottom-up one. And why should this be important? Let me give you a litany of perhaps familiar quotes to you, because Islam often is a conversation stopper when it comes to thinking about democracy. Let's take Paul Johnson, an historian whose work in many ways I admire, who in the 1990s wrote that there's a vast Islamic arc in which democracy, personal freedoms, and the rule of law are denied. It's a fascinating quote. It's easy to grasp, even if it's just totally wrong. One of the world's largest democracies, as you know, is Indonesia. More Muslims live in India, which is, of course, not a Muslim majority place, than live in all of the Arab Middle East. And elections in many places, especially Turkey, are alive and well. It didn't happen overnight, and how these things happen we'll come to in a moment. Amos Perlmutter. These are quotes. I'm not, unfortunately, making them up. Islam is incompatible with liberal with liberalism, human rights, Western-style representative democracy. And if that's too much of a mouthful for you, then go to Daniel Lerner back in the 60s saying the Muslim world faces a stark choice, Mecca or mechanization. At least it's alliterative and easy to remember, but like Sam Huntington's notion of East versus West, it's very much off the point. One of the first public opinion polls in Turkey dealing with Turkish identity, of which I'm aware, took place in 3 years beginning in 1990. Now this is Stone Age, but it's a rather important time because you'll remember the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait at that time and other things, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. A cross-section of Turks were asked, is Turkey Western? I'm sorry, is Turkey European? Is Turkey Muslim? Or is it both? A very steady number of people said it was Western, but it was far from a majority. It was about 11%. Is Turkey Muslim? A certain number said it was Muslim, but in each of the 3 years, the biggest change, and I'm not going to give you all of the statistics, was an increasing number saying it's both. In other words, it's a false dichotomy. You can be Western and you can be Muslim at the same time. And this again is the Gallup organization did the poll, and it gets very much to the point that we're getting to. Many of you would know from political science courses or just general reading the name of Seymour Martin Lipset. It's a very famous political scientist and sociologist who had an interesting definition of democracy in which he would say either you have it or you don't. His notion of democracy was the following: the institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of competing, so that you get a struggle to persuade other people by the power of a vote to decide what the decisions are going to be. Now, so far so good with Lipset in terms of saying, but in his case of saying it, here's where I begin to disagree with him strongly, saying democracy is either present or democracy is absent. And then he would go on with the fatal thing that you keep seeing in a lot of Western thinking of saying that Islam is an obstacle to democracy in some ways. Now, you don't have to go back that far. I've, been around the United States long enough that I can remember, as some people in this room can, the first presidential campaign of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, where in the state of West Virginia, one piece of oral persuasion that was used by the opposition political party was to say that a vote for Kennedy was a vote for the Pope. The implication being that if you were Catholic, you were teleguided from the Vatican. That caused a national stir when that occurred, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody has tried that sort of argument since 1960. If I'm wrong, please correct me. I hope not, but it's still kind of open season in many ways on how Muslims are guided by their faith, which, in a generic sense, I suppose we're all guided by our faith, but at the same time, there are limits. I was asked in a tribal setting in Kuwait once by people who were certainly not academics, but who were at the crossroads of Muslims with different notions, saying, well, Professor, you've been to a lot of Muslim countries. Can you tell us what's the true Islam, al-Islam al-Haqiqi? And I kept a straight face, and I said, God, subhanahu wa ta'ala, may praise be upon him, God knows what the true Islam is, but since God hasn't spoken to any human since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, everybody modern craze. I said, all Muslims and non-Muslims can do is argue about what God really meant. And they laughed, which I thought was a very good sign. And then we had a very constructive discussion about what you do with the various disagreements with the Muslim community and practices, in which even if one's not using the word tolerance, one learns and is reminded that one can be very tolerant. But Libsett would argue that Muslims are guided more by religious doctrines than the rest of us who are not Muslims. There's another way of looking at politics and at getting to democracy, and I'll be very brief about it and then link this to what's happening in Turkey. You can look at politics, I believe, as the setting for decision-making boundaries in a society and enforceable rules for resolving jurisdictional disputes. Heavy language, but think of how the idea of politics has changed since what you've learned, regardless of generations here, in your secondary school textbooks or in other places. What are the hot-button political issues in the United States right now? Gay marriage. Who would ever have thought that a major political hot-button issue would be the status of marriage if you were looking at things from the perspective, let's say, the 1960s or at other times, with conventional notions of nuclear families at an earlier time? And in many ways, in Turkey, a hot-button issue is, can there be a role for religion in public life? Notice I'm not saying politics, I'm saying in public life. This is a distinction that will be very important. Okay, so politics is the setting of decision-making boundaries in society and enforceable rules for resolving jurisdictional disputes. It can be marriage, it can be citizenship, it can be immigration, ways of becoming a citizen. It can be a range of other things of that sort. And the second thing that politics can be is a struggle over people's imaginations. We all think about politics in the old way of a colleague, a friend of mine at Yale, as who gets what, when, and where. I call that the Richard J. Daley approach to politics. I grew up in Chicago. How do you get a state job? My very first job after high school was, I found out 10% of my salary went to the Republican Party, and I said, I don't remember volunteering that. And I was told by my supervisor, well, you have a choice. You can say you didn't volunteer it, and you'll be fired next week, or you can continue to volunteer 10% of your salary. Take your pick. Okay, but a more constructive way of looking at politics is thinking of it as a struggle over people's imaginations. How you can get people to believe in a certain way of doing things, whether it's in the details or whether it's in an overall approach. And in this way, I think, Turkey, again, is good to think with. Now, Turkey, like just about every other country in the world that you can think of, has undergone a real revolution from below in terms of how people can speak in public and contribute to public debate. Let's take things that we often don't even consider to be part of politics. One is the rise of mass higher education. Turkey, whether it's the time of the Ottoman Empire or whether it's the time of the Republic, has always had first-rate elite institutions educating a tiny minority of people. But what has happened since the mid-20th century, and especially since the 1960s and 70s, is a massive and rapid growth of secondary education, both public and private, and of university education. If you visited Turkey in 1988, you would have seen a few universities and technical institutes. With the exception of Boğaziçi University, former Robert College, almost all of them were state institutions. And technically speaking, in Turkey, the private institutions are also state institutions, but it's kind of a little trick about how it's done. Today, you will see literally hundreds of institutions carefully regulated by the Republic of Turkey, but education, higher education, is within the access of large numbers of people. Now, this is not that unfamiliar from other places. The United States of today, higher education is more accessible to larger numbers of people than it would have been earlier. But in Turkey, the numbers have simply skyrocketed as they have in other places as well. And the other is mass communications, resulting in a proliferation of opinions of different sorts. Turkey has a very thriving newspaper industry, and if you've visited Turkey, or just imagine it in any way, internet has radically changed how people can speak and in which languages they can speak in public. In the 1980s, the German Federal Republic passed a law saying that the children of immigrants, and at that time Turkish immigration from Turkey was widely encouraged, were able to get educated in elementary schools in their native language, which the Germans interpreted as not the state language, which would be Turkish, but the languages people actually spoke, which included Kurmanche and the other, quote, Kurdish dialects or languages prevalent in Turkey. And in Germany, one was beginning to get local television broadcasting and radio broadcasting earlier to Turks, but in languages other than Turkish. It was this competition over people's imaginations, if you wanted, that meant that soon the Republic of Turkey, not immediately, very grudgingly, began opening up the possibility of speaking in languages other than Turkish as well. So you're beginning to get a movement, if you wish, from below, often not formally acknowledged by the state, but in which the state has a choice of trying to block things or censor, as in the old patterns of censorship, or of allowing an opening up of things and finding that despite the problems that Turkey has in some areas, that one could do it. And let me give you an anecdote about what this opening up and rise of mass higher education is. In the 1960s in Turkey, one began getting a number of scholarships from the U.S. Agency for International Development for young Turks from some regions, usually regions not favored in education, to come to the United States to study practical subjects, including agriculture, agricultural engineering, and things of that sort. In 1988, I remember a conversation with a dean of one of the universities in Istanbul. I deliberately shall not name which, but it was saying to me that the United States is subverting the Republic of Turkey because a lot of these people from the rural areas and small towns are deeply religious. They go to the United States, they get a degree that's not as quality driven as my degree, for instance. I love that phrase. But they have religion on their mind, and they think religion can be expressed in public as well. And I would listen to this. I'm an ethnographer, which means you don't always get into arguments about things, but I would ask for her to give the best possible explanation. And she was right in one way, because this was one of the first conversations I had that suggested that you were getting very profound transformations in the middle class in Turkey. The middle class was growing. The number of people who could invest money for their children to go to schools, and if they didn't like the public schools, to go to private schools, was increasing at a very rapid pace. The number of people who had immigrants in their family who had gone to Europe, mostly to Germany, but to other places, was likewise increasing. I don't commute regularly to the greater Atlanta area, but in the short time I'm here, and by conversation with Turkish friends elsewhere, the Turkish community locally is growing, and the Turkish community here doesn't lose ties with its past. There's a good give and take on a regular basis, including of various types of religious or religiously inspired organizations at the same time. A very interesting thing, and I think a very basic one, is the growth of Turkish institutions or Turkish movements that are not state-driven in any way. One clear example of the opening up of Turkey is the Fethullah Gülen movement, for example. How many of you have heard very much about Fethullah Gülen in this room? Yeah, Dan has. Okay, you're studying the immigrant community. Okay, others. It's a very interesting individual who was born in 1938 in a very remote part of Turkey and trained to be a state preacher. Now in Turkey, the only people who can lead prayers in a mosque or give religious lessons are people licensed by the state. This is one of the compromises that happened after Turkey became a republic, and they're very carefully controlled. If the math works out, Gülen was 15 when he became such a preacher, because the official biographies say it was at the age of 15. I've met him several times. I've never gotten to that detail of asking him. But by 1958, he was imam, or was teaching in a mosque in Edirne, which is another smaller town in Turkey, and then in '66 went to Izmir. Now, in his youth, he was part of a, now if I write on that wall, I'll be convicted of graffiti. I can't. He was part of an earlier movement called the Risalet-i Nur movement, founded by Said Nursi, born in 1883, as I recall, and who died in, I believe it was 1960, who thrived in the Ottoman Empire, was doing various official and semi-official things. Then under the Turkish Republic, because of his popularity, here I'm speaking of Said Nursi, was regarded with increasing suspicion, was put under house arrest beginning, somebody in the room can correct me, beginning, I believe, 1930. And gradually, certainly by 1950, restrictions on his movements relaxed, but in the 20 years when he was under big restriction, he was able to complete a major work called Risalet-i Nur, the letters of light, if you want it literally, but his name, remember, is Nursi. So it's kind of the epistles covering, used in a style of parables and metaphors. Now, a beautiful thing, if you're writing in parables and metaphors and you have to watch government censors, is your writing isn't time-specific. You have to write in such a way that you can transcend immediate issues. And the Nursi movement did this quite well, and this is a movement that is alive, well, and transnational today. But, to cut to the chase, and then I'll fill in things in between, the Gülen movement, which doesn't have membership cards or anything else, I assure you, in my judgment, is perhaps the most significant Islamic movement in the world today. It has transcended the boundaries of Turkey, and it's learning very well how to communicate to other Muslim populations. Sometimes unevenly so, but if you were in Central Asia, as I was in the early 90s, if you found articulate people who could speak in pretty good English, the Turkish, I don't speak Turkish, so I can't speak very much to that. It often would be people associated with one part or another of the Gülen movement, especially various forms of education and emphasis on science. You can visit Gülen schools in because they exist now. There's about 500 schools, as far as I can tell. There's no one big association, but my best estimate is there's about 500 schools in a very large number of countries. New Jersey is not a country, but I've seen Gulen schools in New Jersey as well, open to African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and others at very, very competitive rates, much lower in cost than private schools that you would see elsewhere. Now, one of the reasons is the volunteerism of the teachers in them. You quite often have highly motivated Turks working with the movement who will come and teach in these schools in exchange for very little cash reward of any sort, and scholarships are very easy to come by. It's the notion of education as a public good, if you want, as a civic virtue, which drives the movement. And in all of the schools in Turkey, as elsewhere, local laws are rigorously adhered to. So you don't get a missionary element of these movements, except perhaps by the example of civic virtue, which shows in what the teachers are doing. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is in this movement, which I'm characterizing as perhaps the most significant Muslim movement in the world today, more significant perhaps than the Muslim Brotherhood movement was from the 1920s to the 40s and beyond, is the fact that it is non-political, except in the sense of urging people to have a civic virtue and to have a civic consciousness. There's a phrase in Arabic, maslahat al-amma, the public good, and in that sense, the movement is political, but in the diffuse sense, not in the more specific sense, for example, of the Turkish constitution. Gülen was a member of the Risalet-i Nur movement, or participated in it, was deeply influenced by it for a while, but then began to be, let us say, to acquire the sort of voice you need to transcend local or national boundaries. You can see a record of his work, certainly in Turkish, and translated, large part of it is translated into English at the same time. The movement now has a university in Istanbul, Fatih University, and it is probably soon going to open others as well. But again, there's no big central command or anything. It's an affinity of different movements. In fact, when a hostile state prosecutor tried to indict Fethullah Gülen for something, the state prosecutor, who's not one of the best and brightest, as far as I can tell, in anybody's legal establishment, was astonished because he said, "There's nothing for us to seize. The man owns nothing." It's simply people contributing to the movement in different ways. You have a network of schools pervading Central Asia, Eastern Europe, United Kingdom, Africa, Mongolia, where I personally visited the schools, and, as I say, New Jersey. New Jersey has a favorite spot in my heart, being from another part of New England. What is more interesting about Gülen is when I first met him, he would have regular television broadcasts from Istanbul, where he'd live a very simple life on the top floor of one of the secondary schools. But since 1999, has been living in the United States, first in New Jersey, and subsequently in Pennsylvania in the Poconos Mountains. But the movement has brilliantly captured, figured out how to use modern technology to spread itself. So you can join Gülen in the Poconos, see a lesson circle, much like the things that I would see in various parts of the Arab world, or Iran, or India, or other places, except that they would be broadcast live via webcam for those who wanted to follow the movements as well. The websites are astonishingly clear, And the aims of the movement, as I say, is to emphasize science and a dedication to learning, and I might even go so far as to say to critical thinking at the same time. Now, what does this all have to do with democracy? It would be the following, I would say. Number one, Turkey has, since the 1990s and since the demise of the military regime, learned how to allow multiple voices in public. The Turkish constitution is adamant that Turkey is a secular republic. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But what does the meaning of secularism, as in our country, is something that has to be constantly negotiated and debated. If I were an expert on Turkey, I might talk about the rise and fall of various religiously motivated parties in Turkey in the 1990s and beyond, or the current political situation in Turkey. As an anthropologist, I would invite you to stand back and look at the long-term trend, which would be this, that the religiously inspired parties in Turkey, such as the Refah Party of the 1990s, by trial and error, learned how to communicate in public without frightening the radical secularists. In 1996, you see some people from Atlanta, so you've heard this before, so you can shut your ears off for a moment. I was interviewed by somebody from a very secularist newspaper, Hurriyet, who put on a tape recorder and said, how great of a threat is Islamic fundamentalism to Turkey. And I decided this wasn't the time to argue about the meaning of fundamentalism or anything like that. And I said, this is just as great a threat as radical secularism to Turkey. The tape recorder went off, the interview was done. Now, had I said the opposite, Turkey is facing a grave danger, and then I could have mockingly quoted, as I did before, from Daniel Lerner, plagiarizing him, and say, Turkey faces a stark choice, Mecca or mechanization, and that could have been the headline for the next day, I guess. Eickelman says Mecca or mechanization for us. Beware of it doesn't work that way. What has happened is one has been able to separate in Turkey religiously motivated people in the public sphere from the sense of religion pervading and somehow controlling the public sphere. Vast majority of Turks are Muslim. So in a sense, it's not a question of faith as such. The question is how people operate in society. I do a lot of work in North Africa, and I remember in the late 1990s being fascinated to see in the Arabic press in Morocco a representative of the still dominant United Front of Socialist Parties, a very secular political party, saying we can learn a lot from Turkey's Refah Party about how to conduct elections. And the man went on to say that of all of the political parties in Turkey, what was unique about this religiously inspired party was its ability to garner grassroots support. In Turkey to this day, there is let's say, a social separation of men and women. I'm choosing my words carefully because it's nothing enforced, but it's just kind of, you don't feel right. Or Turks tell me if the men and the women are sitting too close together if they're not related in various ways. You can go to various functions and you'll see women sitting in one, not all women, some women will cross the lines, and women sitting in one area and men in the other. But what the Refah Party had pioneered, unlike other parties, was the very obvious thing that women, like men, could use telephones, and developing telephone trees, much as the Obama campaign has done so, of getting people to communicate in various ways for the 1990s electronically, so you could reach large numbers of households and take advantage of the fact that Turks, both men and women, were able to vote and to get out the vote. They did it much better than any of the other political parties, and they won first the municipality elections in Istanbul, and then in different ways the religiously inspired parties won national elections. But more importantly, they persuaded the various people behind the parties that would rise and fall, managed to persuade the military officers, the self-appointed guardians of the Turkish constitution, of the fact that all of the parties were going to play by the rules, by the democratic rules of the state of Turkey. And that is pretty well where things stand now. But I would very strongly argue that one of the best bellwethers of the transformations in Turkey has been the rising prominence in the public sphere, not the political sphere, of religiously inspired organizations pushing education, pushing the development of women, pushing questions of the public good, of mutual support in times of dire economic straits, and in other matters. This bottom-up transformation, I would argue, is a better signal of the long-term consequences for what's going on in Turkey than the top-down approaches that one saw in earlier times, such as the declaration by Ataturk that every man had to cover his head with European beret or hat of some sort. If I were in the hat industry, I would have loved Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, I think. Let me stop here, except to leave you with this one sense, this one, I think, key to understanding developments in Turkey. Once upon a time in the United States, not only in social theory, but in terms of how some people in our country thought in terms of policy, religion was thought of as something that was not very important and an obstacle to really promoting civic values of democracy. I think that we have learned over time that this is not the case. Think of three great revolutions of the late 20th century, whether you like them or not. The Islamic Revolution of Iran, which has had a rocky up and down, but in which I think the forces from below are something that we can live with for a long time to come. Liberation theology in Latin America, where religiously committed individuals, certainly not under the control of the Vatican, did much more to bring the end to despotic regimes and military dictatorships than any infusion of American security assistance or public aid fund of any sort ever managed to do. Or the solidarity movement of Poland. If you take religion out of solidarity, I don't think you have very much left. It's a very integral part of a movement that brought about a real transformation. In Turkey, we're not looking at revolutions. In Turkey, what we're looking at is a growth in participation in civic institutions and in public life that's encompassing larger numbers of people who can speak up and do what modernity is supposed to do, to give individuals much more of a say in what they are doing. And in this sense, movements such as the Gülen movement have been extremely important and I think are very good indications of the sort of continuing ability in Turkey to move much more of the debates which used to be thought of in terms of conspiracy theories and what was going on behind the scenes into a vigorous public discussion of who are we and where we should be going. And with those words, let me end and invite questions. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, how has this movement affected the rural sectors of Turkey where technology is perhaps not quite as advanced as it would be in the larger cities?
I once asked, not once, let me give you a year, 1998, I think it was the second time I met Fethullah Gulen when he was still in Turkey. He was surrounded by television cameras, and before I saw him, he would have advisors talking with him, and the room where I met him was in kind of a reception area that doubled as a television studio from which many of his broadcasts were. And I asked him, how does your work today differ from where you were 10 years ago? And he gave a very interesting answer. He said, 10 years ago, I had more face-to-face contact with people. Now I have to imagine that contact because I'm looking, of course he would be surrounded by many of his followers, but he would rarely appear at large public meetings, even when he was in Turkey. It would be through the video means. In something I wrote at the time, in early 1997 or 1998, article very dramatically called Inside the Islamic Reformation. I've since written something called Whatever Happened to the Islamic Reformation. That's another story. I referred to him as Turkey's equivalent of Billy Graham. Now, Billy Graham of the 1950s really knew how to manage large audiences, but also could manage small groups when you would have that sort of thing. He sometimes would be, he being Billy Graham, the advisor to heads of state and rulers. Now, Gulen, to the best of my knowledge, never has been, but he's been inspiration, I think, to many to how to behave in public. And his rural background, to go to the heart of your question, is one where he will be able to speak in parallels in a language where you can understand it in different ways. Scientists and engineers, Turkish scientists and engineers, are captivated by his notion because in the Arab world I can deal more with villagers and I don't have to have a screen of interpreters. But I am assured by Turkish friends that he has this ability still to communicate in rural areas and to communicate quite well. And if you think about any religious movement or non-religious movement for that matter, this ability to transcend lines of class, lines of education, lines of region is very important. And in that sense, he's done quite well. Turks in the room can comment on his abilities to incorporate or to make, for instance, people of Kurdish origin feel a part not only of the Turkish nation, but of the wider Islamic community. Thank you. Yeah, ma'am.
So, my understanding, what you're saying here is that because religion fosters solidarity between people, they tend to be more encouraged to engage in public debate. And in the case of Turkey, Islam is the religion that encourages people to be have solidarity and engage in public debate, and therefore Islam and democracy are compatible in that sense. Is that what you're saying?
Let me change your words slightly. That's one of the things I always kind of like to do. Islam exists. Islam to me is a big arena in which people who call themselves Muslims argue about what the correct path is. And some will argue very vigorously, and in Turkey, most people are learning to do so very civilly. Despite the fact that the Turkish state is thought of as trying to break up religious influence in the country, which they would do by disbanding, for instance, madrasas, schools of learning, in the 1920s after the declaration of the Republic, and having only a few rather mediocre, to be frank about it, teacher training institutes to authorize state places to learn religion. Islam is, and I would argue has been, alive and well in Turkey. In my first visit in 1988, I remember people with kind of a grin saying, "We want to take you on a pilgrimage." And I said, "What do you mean?" And they took me to the mother of the then prime minister, a secularist, had just died, and she was buried near a saint shrine. And so I said, "Yeah, so what? This is very common in North Africa." And he said, "Well, this is what there is, that, you know, in the man's personal life, there still is this deep attachment to the faith. And this is not just the traditional issue of where you bury your mother, which is obviously very burning, even if the son is a prime minister, a very key issue. Rather, the question is how you can use your faith in a way that doesn't exclude other people to work for some civic good." And this is, I would argue, perhaps one of the most important developments of Islam as it's worked out in Turkey. That's why I'm changing your words. I'm not saying that this is, you know, some would argue with me, "Oh, this is inherent in Islam." And my argument would be, in Islam, as in other faiths, you have to work hard to persuade other people of what is central and what is inherent. And that's the sort of work that I believe that is becoming very mainstream in Turkey at the present time. Yes?
You mentioned before about Islam not necessarily playing a revolutionary role, but maybe more of a transformative role. Do you see a point to where, will Turkey just simply shift to have a more open government? Or how are they going to address the issues of religion constitutionally and through their forms of government?
Let me break down your very good question into two parts. Islam can be revolutionary. I think any time you see the logo of Hezbollah, they've changed it recently, the Party of God. If you read it in Arabic, it's Hezbollah fi Lubnan, the Party of God in Lebanon, indicating that they're not trying to change the world. We're trying to change something in Lebanon. That's changed recently. Now it's Hezbollah without the fi Lubnan in Lebanon part. Islam can be profoundly revolutionary, and it has been. It can be violently so in the hands of some people. But it can also be, and I would argue that this is the story that I don't think is reported enough, it can also be something that is mainstreamed and that's bringing people into civic participation in different ways. I'm reviewing a book right now by somebody called Raphael Israeli on Muslim minorities in the West. That's a good start. It's an interesting issue, but not the way he does it. He begins with public opinion polls taken right after September 11th, in which a Pew Charitable Trust poll apparently found a large number of Americans saying that all Muslims should be put into internment camps, just as the Japanese were in World War II. This was not the finest moment, I hope you will agree, of American democracy, to round up Japanese and put them away. And then the author, Mr. Israeli, goes on to say, public opinion was right. This should have been done. And what an extraordinary sort of statement to make in a book that's coming out, that came out in 2008. But Islam can have both faces, and I would argue, and you can say the same thing of other religions, by the way, at the same time. There's nothing unique to Islam, although if Mr. Israeli would be here, he would say that I was absolutely wrong and I'm just a sympathizer against dangerous things, and that I would answer something, perhaps I'd lose my cool and say something very impolite in response. But the second, so one issue is Islam can be both, but then I would argue that the story that doesn't make the evening television news is that the mainstreaming of Islam, in which you have civil engagement, is the big thing that we ought to be looking for. And it's a very unpleasant message for radicals or revolutionaries or others, and it takes a lot of hard work. But you can get sudden transformations. I was one of those who had just about given up hope in our national political campaigns to see any change in any significant way over what we had since over the last two presidential campaign cycles, and I'm glad to say I was wrong. I underestimated the ability of large numbers of the voting population to try to do something very different. And Turkey, for what everybody is saying about the limits of democracy or the scepter of the military taking over again, I don't think this is going to happen. Turkey has real challenges, and these economically distressing times will have more challenges. But I think people have the flexibility to meet those quite well. Yes, ma'am.
I know we had some meetings from last year from the North African countries about a top-down scheme that really changed what you call the development of women.
Did I probably used that phrase. That's the awkward thing about having 3 different television cameras here. If you misspeak, you can't take your words back. Go ahead.
And in Turkey, I know you're here, you're talking about a bottom-up scheme.
Yeah.
Do you think that relates, they have a somewhat more grouped, like less individualistic type culture than we do here in America, though not as extreme as do you think that the bottom-up approach works better because of that cultural underpinning?
Let me transport you to Piscataway, New Jersey, home of one of the Gulen schools, where there was a women's meeting nearby. I was invited on what you could call the boys' side. The women, who were all muhajabat in Arabic, headscarf and so forth, learned that somebody was lurking in the building and demanded from the boys, their husbands or relatives, that I be brought in, talk to them. And I said, let me be a devil's advocate. Now, devil's advocate is a hard phrase to translate if you're not a native speaker of English. And I said, since Satan usually doesn't like to say, hi, I'm Satan, let me pretend to be somebody asking the hard question. And I asked that question, look at you. You're all wearing headscarves. You're all wearing long robes. Where's your individuality? And we had a fascinating discussion where they gave lots of examples of what they were doing, and there was no problem at all. It's clothing. Well, in France, in Turkey, and in Egypt, how you choose to dress yourself is a big political statement. It is not a unique statement. I mean, there's a number of muhajabat in this room now, and if this were time for American-style personal testimony, some people might say religious motivation. Some might say, well, I'm from a certain area, and this is what my family expects. It's more just my tradition, or there could be a number of reasons. And as I've learned in Morocco, it can be rebellion. Could be a young lady in a family who just wants to rebel against father and mother, and what better way than to become muhajaba, to wear a headscarf, and then say, look at you, mother and father, you're not Muslim, I'm a Muslim. And it's harder to answer that sort of thing. And I would argue that we have to get beyond thinking of religion as a conversation stopper, even when some religious people, as in the example of the teenage rebel, who's now, by the way, happily married in Canada, and she's and living a different sort of, and she's past her stage of going on. A question up there.
Yeah, you mentioned something about there may be limits to democracy and freedom in terms of Turkey as a nation right now. Isn't that what we're seeing right now in the conflict that's been going on now for a few years between Denmark and Turkey? And right now the Turkish government is trying to block the Danish Prime Minister from becoming NATO's new General Secretary based on this whole issue of the Mohammed drawings in the Danish newspaper, and this idea where they are wanting Denmark as a nation to apologize for something that a local, privately owned, democratic newspaper chose to do. And the Prime Minister of Denmark is saying, we're not going to apologize for something that had nothing to do with us as a nation. This is a free nation with a free press. And where the Turkish government right now is having this conflict and has had for quite a few years now. What would some of your thoughts be about that?
It took about 4 or 5 months to cook the Danish cartoon controversy in the following sense. Perhaps a number of people in this room, what was the name of the newspaper? The Elings, I don't speak Danish, but...
The newspaper called Jyllandsposten.
Jyllandsposten, thank you very much.
156,000 readers now.
Thank you very much, and it sounds as if you've got strong local knowledge. Nonetheless, with 156,000 members, it took approximately 3 months and a small group of activists a fair amount of time to send a kind of portfolio of things to various Saudi groups and to Iranian groups. And then you were beginning to get a competition over, guess what, who speaks for Islam. And at this point, I can't recall whether the Saudis took up the mantle or whether it was the Iranians, but the crucial thing that I would point out is it took 3 months of strong, if you want to use the term, public relations work to get the news of what 156,000 readers of a Danish newspaper were getting pushed onto the world stage. You might think that that was a relatively fast sort of thing, but as you are reminding me at the present time, the story has more than a good half-life. You can have others. I would go back to get a sense of perspective to the Salman Rushdie issue, where I worked very closely with a Pakistani colleague who was sending me a kind of a synopsis of translations of what the Urdu newspapers were saying about the satanic verses when they came out. And it was a rather fascinating argument that you would not think of in the West. You'd have the unimaginative argument, in my judgment, about saying, oh, this is an insult to Islam and X, Y, and Z should happen to Rushdie. You can have your own opinions about whether Rushdie at one point was excitedly writing to his publisher and things that have been made public, saying, hey, people are being killed because of my book in India. Why don't you get this out to the newspapers so that it can, draw more attention to my book? But the argument in Pakistan was, to me, a very unusual one. The Daily Jang, as I remember, one of the leading Urdu newspapers, wrote, in this issue, which got seized by the government, we are publishing extracts from the satanic verses. We are doing so because our Muslim brothers and sisters in England, as distasteful as this novel is, are capable of reading it for themselves and making their own judgment. Why should we, Pakistanis, be subject to government censorship? Are we not mature? Do we not have the ability to decide for ourselves? Here, dear readers, you can see it for yourself. The issue of the Daily Jang was seized, but it was a question of freedom and of the sense that if anybody is going to read a newspaper in Urdu, that they're also going to be capable of exercising their own reason to decide whether this is offensive, and if it is offensive, in what way it's offensive, rather than having somebody decide it for them. Now, in this case, I'm not very well versed on what's happening right now between Denmark and Erdogan, but I would like to look at the backstory again, and thank you for bringing to my attention the fact that, well, number one, that I will never again say in public, a small Danish newspaper, 156,000 is a pretty good number. It's larger than Kennesaw, larger maybe than newspapers in this area. But the more serious point is it reminds us in a very humbling way of how easy it is to distract people from major global issues by holding up the little thing that can capture the imagination of some people for some of the time. There's more serious issues, I think, to be taken into consideration. Thank you very much. Other questions? Yes.
I've always wondered about claims made by Abu Said in the Shadow of the Quran that the laws of the Sharia should be the laws of government on earth, and that secular governments have strayed from the true meaning that was intended by what was coming out of the Quran in terms of Revelations and so on. How is that? How do you find that in your studies, and how does that apply to Turkey?
One of the biggest issues, as I'm saying, is who speaks for Islam, and we have a large number of claimants to do it. There's a book that took a lot of people by storm that came out in 1990 by a Syrian civil engineer, Mohammed Shahrur, where there are 23 books written in response to it called The Book and the Quran, of Kitab al-Quran, Qira Mu'asira, a contemporary reading, in which Shahrur argued that we have to turn aside the centuries and centuries of jurisprudence, of fiqh, of saying what the Sharia is, and to treat the Quran, or the parts of God's Word, as if God was speaking to us only yesterday about our contemporary things. So once again, without going into his argument, it is an emphasis on the use of critical reason to understand the Sharia. Just one quick example. In the Sharia, if you're in Saudi Arabia, if you're an American diplomat, you will never be allowed to drive. You'll have somebody from another nationality drive. Why? Because if you have an accident, even if it is not your fault, if a little boy jumps in front of a car, and this has happened, and all the eyewitnesses say the driver could not have stopped it, by Saudi law, which applies the same to everybody, if the family wants the head cut off of the driver, they will get it, period. This happened. So a Filipino driver for the American embassy lost his head. The American State Department's argument was, well, the law doesn't discriminate against anybody, it's all the same. Now, many Muslims would argue that in the contemporary circumstances, the so-called hudud punishments, the amputation of arms and legs, is inappropriate. You could use stronger language. It may be appropriate to much more primitive, earlier stages of human life. I don't like Shahrur's use of primitive in that sense, but that today the hududs are the kind of the maximum that you can do. But if you look at all of the other Quranic verses that's talking about the nature of society and the exercise of judgment, this is the most extreme example, but normally you would have other sorts of ways of meting out justice than the other. So yes, you're going to have some people arguing for a almost mechanical application of the Sharia, but let us just say that that's one of many ways of thinking of it. The notion of Sharia that I find more prevalent, and that actually came up in an English court over a lawsuit involving $9 billion a few years ago, is the notion of commonly accepted principles. I remember what it was the Minister for Legal Affairs of the state of Qatar argued. The Sharia is to my country what common law is to England. You don't have to have it written down. It's a set of common assumptions that most people, obviously Qatar is not the largest country in the world, that most people share about what is the public good, maslahat al-amma. And this is a much more open sort of thing than thinking that the Sharia is saying everything and everything's written down, because it's not. The Sharia is a combination, as I understand it, and I'm not a mufti, unfortunately, or fortunately. It is a combination of the Quran, as read and interpreted by certain people, and of the practices of the Muslim community. So it can be a common practice which is not necessarily written down. It's an understanding of what a community considers to be reasonable and just. And the community has a wide way. Some people argue there's one global ummah. But most people would argue when you start looking at what the Sharia does in practice, there's tremendous variation historically and in the present time. I think I've worn people out. Oops, there's 3 video recorders that hear my final words on that. Okay. Thank you for being so patient, and I do commend you to attend the other talks in the Turkey series. You've got a unique opportunity here. Thank you.